Welcome to the Blood Flow Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Hamill. I'm a physician specialized in blood circulation and a writer based in Paris. Today, my guest is AJ Jacobs. AJ Jacobs is an author, journalist, lecturer, and human guinea pig. He has written 4 New York Times bestsellers, including The Know-It-All, One Man's Humble Quest to Become the Smartest Person in the World, and The Year of Living Biblically, which documents his year of following every possible law in the Bible. He has written for the New York Times, Entertainment Weekly, New York Magazine, and has given 4 TED Talks, which have been viewed close to 10 million times. He has appeared on Oprah, The Today Show, Good Morning America, CNN, and one of my personal favorites, The Tim Ferriss Show. His new book is called The Year of Living Constitutionally, and it's available everywhere books are sold. You can find him online at ajjacobs.com. AJ, welcome to the show. I'm really glad to have you here.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
Thank you. So I know you love words. First of all, obviously you're a writer and you wrote a book about puzzles called The Puzzler.
True.
So was one of the perks of studying 19th century documents discovering the origins of some modern sayings? And if so, can you give us some examples?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I loved the language back then. Words like Grumbletonian, which means someone who's sort of cranky and grumbles a lot. But also you learn these stale metaphors and sayings in English that really had lost their flavor. You start to see they had real origins. For instance, flash in the pan, which in English means someone who just appears and disappears, nothing significant, comes from muskets. And I spent a lot of time with muskets for my year of living and it means that the gunpowder in the pan, which is part of the gun, explodes and creates this big flash, but it never goes into the gun barrel to shoot out the lead ball. So a flash in the pan is just a lot of smoke and noise signifying nothing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we'll get back to muskets later. Uh, so as I was saying, you've been called the human guinea pig. Who were some of the writers or explorers who inspired you to pursue this particular style of researching and of writing?
Yeah, I love the genre. And I grew up, there's a writer named George Plimpton who wrote a lot. His specialty was sports. So he was just an average guy, not a great athlete, but he would join for a day the professional football or baseball team and describe what was it like to be in there. He got hit in the face by a heavyweight boxer and wrote about what that was like. I'm not a huge fan of physical pain. I prefer social awkwardness. And so I put myself in very uncomfortable social positions more than physical. Although I've done my share of physical pain. I did one about health and that caused some physical pain. But he was a big influence. I liked Hunter S. Thompson, who was slightly more of a gonzo journalist. I'm not sure I would like him as much now if I read him, because I feel he's a little amoral. Maybe I'm wrong.
You read him when you were a teenager in the early
Yeah,
early
I
20s. Yeah.
loved it. I mean, he would take a lot of drugs and then go crash political conventions or drive to Las Vegas and write
Yes.
about his. But he was very creative, and I loved his style of writing. It was very energetic,
Yeah.
and it was not something just the words jumped off the page.
And what would you say is the one of the common denominators of these various influences? Is it curiosity, empathy, fearlessness?
I think, well, sir, I'm certainly not fearless. I am terrified all the time. So I wouldn't say that. And I think fearlessness is actually a bad quality. You want to have some fear, rational fear. You want to push yourself to be outside the comfort zone. But fearless people I would avoid them.
They don't last long.
Yeah, no, that's a bad quality. But yes, curiosity is one of my favorite human drives. I love it. And I feel I'm not the smartest person in the world and certainly not the most athletic, but I do think I score very high on curiosity. I am curious. As Alex Trebek, who I once interviewed, the Jeopardy host, he had a quote that I love. He said, "I'm curious about everything, even those things that don't interest me," which doesn't really make sense, but it also does. I totally get the paradox. I could be interested in the most boring topic, and once you dig in, it's not boring.
Exactly.
I'm sure counting is fascinating once you dig in.
And I found that in medicine, although medicine is very interesting, when you find micro specialty and you dig in, at first even when you're not interested in, then you're gonna see a whole world in this like micro specialty. So
Right,
it's
exactly.
fascinating.
I love that.
Um, I interviewed Oliver Berkman on the podcast, and he has a great phrase for explaining how people think the universe is actually paying much more attention to them than it really is. He calls it cosmic insignificance therapy. And and as you mentioned, you seem to have developed this muscle a great deal, either by stoning adulterers in Central Park, like you did for your year of living biblically, or by wearing a tricorn hat for over a year, I guess, for the whole year, and for the podcast, which is really nice. I like it.
Thank you.
So, how did you develop this strength to be sort of immune to other people's thoughts or comments?
Well, first of all, I'm totally not. I'm human, so I still pay far too much attention. And we shouldn't be immune to other people's thoughts. We should be immune to their critical thought, to unhelpful thoughts. But we don't want to be psychopaths and be completely immune. But I would say part of it is a friend of mine said that I don't mind looking ridiculous uh, to help a good cause and I do. So that's the way I hope to frame my life, that hopefully these books and projects do make me a better person, even though I look ridiculous while doing them. And I'm wearing a tricorn hat now. I look absurd. Uh, but in the end, I hope to have some takeaways, some wisdom that not only makes my life better, but that I can share with the reader and make their life better. So it's sort of I'm 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 okay looking like a an idiot if I can help uh, myself and others. So that's part of it. Um, Part of it is I don't think I'm a great actor, but I feel that there's this phrase method acting where you get, and I feel I'm more of a method writer. I love to take on a persona and explore it and see the world through another person's eyes. And that I think is great for compassion. It's great for cognitive flexibility, all sorts of things.
Mhm.
So I don't recommend everyone do this, but I do recommend more experimentation in everyone's life, whether that's, you don't have to carry a musket around New York, but you can try a new toothpaste every month. You can take a new way to the office if people
Right.
still worked at offices. Uh, you can take a new way from your bedroom to your
Your
office, I guess.
laptop.
Yeah. So yes, I do recommend it, and those are some of the motivators of why I'm okay, even though it is still embarrassing.
Makes total sense. So, how much did you know about the Constitution before starting this project, the year of living constitutionally?
Well, very little, but I'm not an outlier. Most Americans, according to research, have not read the U.S. Constitution, even though it's 4 pages long. I mean, they're long pages, but it takes maybe 20 minutes to read the whole thing. And yet, what's weird is American political debate and discourse is so centered on the Constitution. Everyone talks about it, but very few actually read it. So I thought, not only do I want to read it, but I want to get inside the minds of the founders to see what did those words mean when they were written in 1789.
And
And
how we can interpret them today. I know that was a big part of the project.
huge part, right? How should we use the Constitution today? Because the way we interpret it makes a huge difference, and
Sure.
we've seen that in U.S. politics. It has affected women's health and abortion with the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court and the gun decisions. So it has a massive impact. And I also loved reading about foreign constitutions, including the French Constitution,
Mm.
because when we wrote, we had the first official constitution. There was the Magna Carta, but we had the first constitution. And so we had very little data to work on. Now there are dozens and hundreds of constitutions. So should we rethink our constitution in light of those other constitutions? Some people say absolutely not. That's un-American. I like to think that evolution and change is part of America's DNA.
And what do you think the American Constitution owes to these prior forms, like the Magna Carta or the Roman Constitution? And in turn, what did the later constitutions owe to the American one?
Well, it is fascinating. I mean, they study, the founding fathers were obsessed with Greece and Rome, and they also were obsessed with the notion of virtue, which is the Roman notion of self-sacrifice, putting the good of the community or country on equal footing with your own. And that is actually a lovely notion that I think we need to revive and have a little more of this sense of because they believed in the Bill of Rights, but also the Bill of Responsibilities or Obligations. They just never wrote it because they figured it was so obvious that people would contribute to the community. So yes, big influence on Rome, from Rome. And then the other countries have taken a huge amount from America's Constitution, including the balance of powers, which I think is very important. But there is a split. There's the presidential system, which is what we have, and then there's the parliamentary system, which is what a lot of European countries have. And there are pros and cons to both systems. I happen to think that there's a great book called American Parliament about how we should consider shifting a little towards more of a parliamentary system. And some of the advantages are we wouldn't have this rigid two-party system. That's one advantage. Another advantage is the president has gotten way too powerful, and both Republican and Democrat. And this was one of my favorite parts, reading it in the convention, in the Constitutional Convention in 1780, had voted the different way.
So we will come back to these two notions, but I wanted to know if you could explain the difference between originalists and living constitutionalists and how it informed your decision to go as full originalist as possible.
Absolutely. I mean, it is such an important distinction. And I kind of, I wrote a book many years ago called The Year of Living Biblically, which explored a very similar issue. How should we interpret the Bible? And for that one, I followed the rules. I had the huge beard and the robe and the 10 Commandments. But in religion, there are people who say we've got to take the words literally as they were written. So homosexuality is a sin. Other people say, no, it evolves. The meaning evolves. It's a continual wrestling match with the meaning. And the same applies to the Constitution. You have people who believe in originalism, which is mostly, not totally, but mostly a conservative movement. And they believe the most important thing when looking at the Constitution is the original meaning from 1789, or whenever the amendment was ratified. And the other side says, no, we have to evolve. This was written 237 years ago. They didn't know about all sorts of, they didn't know about the internet. They didn't know about automatic weapons. So we have to evolve the meaning. Now, they both have their pros and cons, these approaches. But they yield very different worlds. So, for instance, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is very famous, came after the Civil War, and it says, it promises due process and equal protection. Now, when that was written, those men were not thinking about gay couples who want to get married. They were not thinking about, they weren't even thinking about women. It applied mostly to Black men who were being oppressed after the Civil War. So if you are a strict originalist like Clarence Thomas or Antonin Scalia, two famous justices in the U.S., then you say, well, actually, the 14th Amendment does not protect women, does not protect gay people. So gay marriage is not a constitutionally protected right. We've got to have it goes to the states, and the states can decide. So that's a big difference. Whereas the living constitutionalists, that's the other side. They call themselves pragmatists, living constitutionalists, pluralists, all these names. But the basic idea is we've got to evolve the meaning to change with the times. So yes, the 14th Amendment, those folks did not think about gay rights, but we can't just look at the past. We've got to look not just where the train came from, but where's the train now and where's the train going in the future. We've got to look at societal consequences. And that is the big difference.
It's a huge difference philosophically and with huge consequences on the society for sure. So you decided to go as close to the originalist thinking as possible. You gave yourself a set of rules in the beginning of the book, and but then obviously you had to pick and choose and think about every amendment differently.
Right. Yeah. So that was my quest, was to become the ultimate originalist and actually follow the Constitution using the mindset and technology from 1789. And so, yes, that's why I carried my musket around. That's why I gave up social media and wrote with a quill pen. And it was fascinating to see what that life was like. And it was interesting also to see one of the big themes is on the one hand, we don't want to return to the 18th century. It was many ways it was sexist and racist, and medicine. Like, I would not be going to a doctor like you because they might do a tobacco smoke enema where they literally blow smoke up your ass, and that's supposed to be healthy and cure your ailments. On the other hand, there are elements and ideas from the 18th century that are worth revisiting. And one I already mentioned was virtue, but there's also this idea of writing offline. They didn't have the internet. And I think when I wrote with a quill pen, it changed the way I thought. It was much more conducive to cold takes as opposed to hot takes, much more conducive to sort of nuanced and subtle thinking. So that's another example of something I would love to see revived.
Yeah. So how did you choose your quill and your ink? Was there a lot of choice, or
Yeah, well,
if
what's lovely
really?
is there is, I don't know if they have this as much in France, but there is a historical reenactment movement. Do they have that in France? Do they have like,
I'm not aware, but probably I have to look into it.
well, they do mostly the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, but these people will dress up and go out and reenact these battles. But they are very committed to being authentic. So they make their own clothes, and they, you can't carry a bottle of water. It has to be a certain type of canteen. And so they are actually really interesting. And there is another benefit to DIY culture, which I think people are discovering. But just making my own quills really connected me to the act of writing.
Oh, you made the quill.
I did. I would get.
Oh, really?
I mean, I don't have a goose farm or a turkey farm, so I did order the feathers over the internet, ye old internet. But I would take and I would carve them. There are these videos on YouTube how to carve a quill, and it was lovely. I just a feeling of accomplishment when you create something that you use. So that is, and then the ink. The ink is made. You can get it from various vendors, and it is made from wasp nests, crushed up wasp nests.
That's
And
crazy.
so yeah, it is. It was not a vegan time. There's
Yeah, a lot
quills.
of
There's
animals
a lot of it,
involved.
and the Constitution itself is written on calfskin, on treated calfskin called parchment.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you visited the parchment factory upstate New York. How was that? And how do people still use parchment today? How is it used today?
Yeah, it is not used that often. It is, I mean, it is a very smelly and, it is not a clean, delightful modern process. But it is used sometimes for recreating documents for people who are big fans of and want a constitution on parchment. Also, Jewish, there's the Torah is written on parchment, and also it's used like by fancy people for interior decoration, like lamps.
Oh, really? Yeah, right, exactly. And once you stopped writing with a quill, were you able to transfer some of the benefits to going back to computer writing or pen writing?
That's a great question. I think, yeah, I don't think that we all need to go back to a quill, but you can get 80% there just by turning off all access to the internet for an extended period of time, like at least an hour. And that I do think will change the way you write and think. And that's what I continue to do. I don't write all of my current stuff in a quill, but I have these software like freedom software
Mhm.
that will cut you off, tie you to the mast like Odysseus, and prevent you from the siren song of the internet.
Exactly. Put your phone in another room and
It's
stuff like
so
that.
important. Yeah,
It
it's a
is.
little thing, but it's so important.
So let's talk a little bit about the First Amendment, free speech. So what do we get wrong when we think about what free speech meant at the time of the founding fathers?
This was so fascinating to me because I'm a journalist and writer, so I am a fan of free speech, and but I realized I'm a fan of 20th century and 21st century free speech, not the original free speech. And that is an example of where everyone, both progressives and conservatives, get it wrong. And this is a lot of this research is done by great scholars like Judd Campbell at Stanford. Highly recommend him. But he points out that back they had a different conception of rights than we do now. We see rights now as very almost absolute trump cards. Back then, you were born with natural rights, but they thought once you enter into a society, you have to give up some of those rights because you are in a group and you have to think of the good of the group. So it's a balance between having rights and the group being able to modulate those rights. And this was seen in the First Amendment. They when they said free press, they didn't mean you could write any. It meant you didn't have to get permission from the king to print a book, but once the book was out there, the government had had an absolute right to censor it, to punish you, and there were state laws that were much more constrictive than we have now. There were laws against blasphemy in America. I always thought, oh, this is a free religion. No, state laws in New York at the time of the founding, if you blasphemed, you were fined 37 and a half cents. And I tried to I have teenage kids, so I was like, this sounds a good way to clean up. And and it didn't work because they said, I don't have a half cent. But it wasn't just blasphemy, it was also cursing. Every curse that you did was a fine. And there was much stricter sedition laws than we have now. I mean, every late night comedian would be in jail now if we had the sedition laws during the John Adams era, for instance.
But
So it
all
was,
so sorry, but so
yeah,
all these laws, they came after the Constitution, so they were also kind of adaptations or interpretations of the First Amendment, because it's not written like that in the First Amendment, but that was how it was interpreted at the time. Is that what the
right.
research shows?
Right, exactly. I mean, there were laws before, but they stayed on the books and they enacted new laws. But yes, even after the Constitution, with its free speech clause, uh, the speech was not a free for all. I mean, it's not a free for all now that you can't threaten the president or vice president, for instance. But back then, it was much more constrictive. I mean, it's not Stalinist Russia. Um, but it was certainly nowhere near what we have now. And of course, now free speech, there's a big debate over. Some people, including me, think that there are infringements from both the right and the left of free speech, and that we do need to be a little more open and have less censorship. But it's actually not that different from the founding. Like, so if you can't argue, oh, we have to go back to the founding's free speech, because that was very different.
So it's kind of the same. We can still, I mean, it's the same. We can have free speech without paying, obviously, because now you don't have to pay to put out a book, but you can still get censored. So that's the same as the time.
Right. Well, I think it's still a lot freer than it was then, and it's still a lot freer than in, I would say, the majority of countries. And but yeah, I do think that there is some threat to free speech from both sides, and it's a complicated issue. And now we have scenarios that we've never had before, like ChatGPT. And so I talked to the legal scholars who said, before, the part of the problem was bad speech, wrong speech, and hurtful speech that was intentional. Now, one of the problems is too much speech. So it's not about censoring, it's about figuring out because ChatGPT just creates endless speech. So part of the problem is, how do we ensure that there's a fair marketplace of ideas when there is just endless opportunity for false and misinformation and disinformation?
So, other than the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are some of the other forgotten heroes of the Constitution of democracy? Because we always think of the most famous founding fathers.
Right.
Who do we forget to thank?
Well, there's one I love who is a woman no one's ever heard of. I certainly hadn't, named Febb Byrne, Febb Byrne. And we can thank her for women getting the vote. And it shows that one person can actually make a difference, because the 19th Amendment was up for ratification in 1920. And to ratify an amendment, you need 3/4 of the states' legislatures to say, yes, we adopt this amendment. And so this amendment came up, and they needed 36 states to say yes. They had 35. And the 36, the last one it all hinged on Tennessee. And the vote in the state legislature was tied. And it looked like this one guy, Harry Byrne, was going to vote against women. He wore a yellow flower, which meant, I don't approve of women getting a vote. That morning of the vote, his mom wrote a note in and snuck it in his suit pocket. And it said, be a good boy. Be a good boy and do what your mom wants and vote for women to get the vote. And he's like, all right, so I'm going to follow my mom. And so he got the vote. According to legend, he was chased out of the state house by angry anti-women vote legislators. I don't know if that's true, but it is true that she made it, like, one person made a huge difference in
That's
millions
a
of
great
lives.
story.
I love it. Yeah.
So I'm sure you've met dozens of people and witnessed dozens of stories that didn't end up in the book. What are some of your favorite stories that you ended up not including in the book?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, one was I really try to commit to my project, commit to the bit, as my son says. So, I read a lot about 18th century medicine, and as you know, it was not pretty. It was not. They loved bleeding, and there was no anesthesia. There is a lot I learned to be grateful for. I'm grateful for democracy. I'm grateful for anesthesia. I'm grateful for elastic socks, because I wore these socks that fell down and I had to put on little sock belts every day. But I was at the dermatologist getting a mole removed, And I asked her, can you do it without anesthesia? I just want to see what it's like. And she refused. She
Really?
refused. Yeah, she said, I don't want to get sued. I don't want insurance, so I couldn't do that.
America.
I know. You would have done it, right?
Sure.
I should have come to France. So that was one. But yeah, there is it's such a huge topic. I could have written 3 or 4 books on it. I just had to focus. And I wanted it out, and the publisher wanted it out ASAP because they felt it was very timely with the election coming up and the Supreme Court making these really consequential decisions. So I would have spent another couple of months on it, but I just didn't have time.
And so you bought many items that you've mentioned. Some of them, the quill, the tricorn hat, your little sock belts. Were there any these purchases that you ended up regretting or that you ended up not using?
Well, there was, yes, and I did. The book is meant to hopefully be entertaining, but it also has a serious point, and I explore these serious issues, and hopefully you get a crash course and come away with some learning, and in addition to the entertainment. But yes, so there was this one part that maybe was not as serious, because if you are a hardcore originalist, then you have to follow the Eighth Amendment as it was written. Now, the Eighth Amendment is the one that says government cannot do cruel and unusual punishments. But Antonin Scalia said, if you are a true originalist, you have to look at what was cruel and unusual back then in 1791, and that's what you follow. Now, back then, it was not pretty. So, for instance, pillories were just fine. This was where you had to stick your head in a hole in the wood and you put your hands in, and people throw rotten vegetables and much, much worse at you, rocks. It was really, it was not just humiliating, it was physically dangerous. So I thought, let me just, I know I'm not the government, but let me just explore this pillory. And I went on the internet and I did find you can buy pillories. Actually, the shop was in France that I bought it from, and it was on Etsy, and it was a handmade pillory. It was not for actual punishment. It was more for adult entertainment, which is, I have no moral problems with. I just, it's not for me. But I thought I would buy it. And I thought maybe when my kids break the rule, I can say, well, you can have a day of no screens, or you can have 5 minutes in the pillory.
Plus 35 cents and a half.
Exactly. That one, I actually could not bring myself to put them in the pillory. I'm
Probably
not,
good.
I'm too yeah, it's probably good. So the only one I felt comfortable was I put myself in the pillory. And when I got it, I had my wife there to let me out. And of course, she took advantage because she's very clever. So she said, I'll let you out, but only if you agree to fold your sweaters, that kind of thing. So it was a bit of a disaster. But it is proof of how different the world was then. I mean, the pillory. And I think punishment by humiliation is a bad thing. But we have seen, I feel, a resurgence of it. So it's not a dead issue. I feel that internet shaming is sort of a modern version of the pillory. And in one sense, it's effective. Like, it will get you to not say that, but it's also just so against human dignity that I advocate other ways of changing human behavior
Yeah, no,
besides
that's what's
shame.
great. It is entertaining, but it's also really serious, and there's really an equivalence with these public shamings for sure. What can you tell us again about carrying the musket around? Musket from 1812, I think, around the Upper
Yeah,
West Side.
right. So I did go, since the Second Amendment says you can bear arms, but at the time, the most popular arms were muskets. And so I went on ye old internet and bought an actual musket from the 1810, but designed in 1790. And I carried it around New York, which was a weird experience. There were some people who were not happy, who would say, "What the hell are you doing?" Uh, Others were, "Oh, that's a beautiful gun." So we had some people, and then it did come in handy once. So uh, I walked into a coffee shop at the same time as another customer, and he looked at my musket and he said, "You go first. I'm not going to argue." Uh, but then I went and I actually shot it at a firing range, and it's such a different experience from modern guns because it's literally 15 steps. You have to take out the gunpowder, pour the gunpowder, take out the ramrod, put back the ramrod, all these steps. So it is not, it takes several seconds. It took me minutes, but it's certainly, you could not do a mass shooting in the same way. So the question is, and this is a hugely debated question, does the Second Amendment should it cover muskets in the same way it covers AR-15s? So from the progressive point of view, they would say, absolutely not. These are two completely different types of machines. So it would be like you make a law about no wheeled vehicles. I'm sorry, that wheeled vehicles are allowed on this little country lane. But at the time, wheeled vehicles were bicycles or carts. Now we have 18-wheeled trucks. So should those be allowed in the same places? The progressives would say no. The laws need to be updated and regulated because it's such a difference. Now, on the other hand, the pro-gun rights people would say, no, absolutely, it should cover it. Are you trying to say that the First Amendment should only cover words printed by a wooden press like Ben Franklin? No. So it's all about how different the world was, and do we need to adjust? And it's a fascinating topic. I come out on I try to present both sides. I think it's very important to steel man the both sides, like as opposed to straw man. But in the end, I do think that it is such a different machine that it should require different types of laws.
Yeah, and so on this subject, did you find there was some confirmation bias on both sides? Because obviously you can interpret the law and the amendments however you want. Was this maybe a bigger part of this the choice of each side um, on this Second Amendment?
Oh, well, I think that, yeah, confirmation bias, not just here, but everywhere in the Constitution, it's a Rorschach test for the nation. You see what you want to see in the Constitution. And I found the same for the Bible. One of my favorite quotes, I forget whether it's by Blake, I think it's by Blake, the poet, he said, we both read the Bible day and night. You see black and I see white. So these documents are old, and they have a lot of vague general language, and people interpret them the way they want to, which is why I think when looking at the Constitution, we should look at the very high level values such as liberty, equality of opportunity, and general welfare, these types of things. Because once you get down to more specific, once you get down to policies, you can interpret the Constitution in many different ways.
Yeah. And some historians also point out, as you said, that the past was a very different place than the world we live in today. Were you able to organize or participate in debates between originalists and living constitutionalists and historians on the subject of the Second Amendment or on other subjects?
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of my favorite parts. I talked to dozens of constitutional scholars from all over the spectrum. So from the most originalist to the least originalist. And I loved that. And it was interesting to see how how differently the people interpreted the Constitution. But I also talked to historians, and historians who say that both sides distort what the original meaning was. So even conservatives who say that they're hewing to the original meaning are not interpreting the original meaning the way it was because it was such a different worldview. And one of those ways we talked about earlier, which was that that rights were seen in a very different way. Rights were not seen as these absolutes; they were seen as moderated by what's good for the greater good. So it's very hard to get into the mindset of the 18th century. That was another takeaway. I tried, and I loved it, and I maybe got somewhere. But one historian said, it's like trying to get into the mind of an oyster. There's just no way you're going to do it. It is a different country, a different mindset.
Plus, the founding fathers didn't all agree about everything.
Such a great point. Exactly. When people say, oh, the founding fathers thought this or that, no, there was a wide range of beliefs. Likewise, I always find when people says the Bible says this or the Bible says that, no, part of the Bible says this, part of it doesn't. I mean, you've got a very, for instance, in terms of sex, you've got, some very Victorian attitudes, to use an anachronism. But then you've got sort of the Song of Solomon, which is like an erotic poem, and it's very pro-sex.
So you wrote many letters during this year of living constitutionally with your quill and ink. You wrote to the head of Disney about the Constitution's titles of nobility clause. You wrote to New York Governor Katie Hochul to ask permission to conspire to assemble a militia. And you wrote to the head of communications at Space Force. But one I really like is the one you wrote to Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. Can you explain the context of the letter, why you felt compelled to write, and did you get an answer?
Absolutely. I love that story as well. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, those who don't follow U.S. politics, she's a not just conservative, she's sort of a radical extremist who believes in racist and anti-Semitic conspiracies. And so she is out there. And she also said she indicated she's an originalist because she said, someone asked her about abortion and she said, abortion's not in the Constitution, so it's not a right, which is a very originalist thing to say. I found that when you talk to scholars, the Constitution is not inclusive in its pronouns. It does not have they or she. It says he. When it's talking about the president, when it's talking about Congress, how Congress is elected, he and him only. So if you are a true originalist, and the founders did not think that women should be elected politicians. They didn't think they should vote. So I wrote her a note and said, if you are a true originalist, you might want to reconsider running for Congress. You might want to resign because the Constitution, in its original intent, did not mean for women to be representatives. And I sent it off, and I apologized to my great-grandmother, who was a great feminist and a suffragist who fought for the women's right to vote. And I sent it off, but I felt it was my duty. That was part of my, as doing the whole project. I have not heard back from her yet, and she has yet to resign, but fingers crossed.
Yeah, that is a great story. So what would you say are some of the main takeaways from this year of living constitutionally, and what do you hope that people who read the book, who start thinking about the Constitution and what it actually means, get from reading this book?
Yeah, well, I love that. And there are a lot of takeaways. I'll just give two examples. One was how do we look at the Constitution? Because there are people on both sides who say it's outdated and we should not look at it. We need a new Constitution. Maybe that's true, but I like to look at after the Civil War. There was a very instructive debate. I'm sorry, before the Civil War, there was an abolitionist named William Lloyd Garrison, a white man, very famous, and he said the Constitution is a pact with the devil. It is evil. It should be burned because it condones slavery. It doesn't outlaw slavery. And he literally burned it on stage in front of his followers, very much the showman. Now then, the other famous abolitionist was Frederick Douglass, and he was a former enslaved man, and he originally agreed with this guy, but somewhere in the 1850s he changed his mind. He said, no, it's much more productive to look at the Constitution a different way, as a promissory note, as an IOU. It promises these concepts and talks about liberty and equality, but America is obviously not living up to those promises. We have slavery, we have women not being allowed to vote. And so he said, no, let's keep the Constitution, but make America live up to it. And that theme has been echoed by Martin Luther King and Barack Obama. And I find it a very powerful, basically the idea is the seeds of a good society are in the Constitution. And we have to keep struggling to make those seeds come to fruition. So that is one big takeaway. And another, there are dozens, but let me just give you one other, which was that I think one of those, as I said, we don't want to go back to the 18th century, but one mindset they had back then among the founders that I do think is worth looking into again is this idea of epistemic humility, this idea of they were more willing to change their minds. It was not something to be ashamed of. It was not flip-flopping. It was, let's look at the evidence, let's debate it rationally, and be open to changing our minds. Ben Franklin said at the Constitutional Convention, he said, the older I get, the less certain I am of my own opinions. And he told, now no offense to the French, because he told a little joke about the French, and I apologize. This is Ben Franklin. Don't blame me.
Let's hear it.
He said there was this French lady who said to her sister, it's so strange. Why am I the only person I've ever met who is correct on every single issue? And his point was, we're all that French lady. We all think we're right on everything. It's this.
So true.
Yeah. I mean, now there's a whole behavioral economics and Daniel Kahneman, but he was there 230 years ago. And his point was we have to be open to changing our minds, not willy-nilly, not like, like joining a cult is changing your mind, but looking at the evidence rationally and scientifically and just trying to come to, if something goes against your beliefs, then say, okay, well, my beliefs were wrong, and that's not bad. That's a good thing that I'm able to evolve. So that was another huge takeaway that I think I think the world needs it, but especially America, where we're so intransigent, we're so stuck in our tribes and refusing to budge in any direction.
Okay, well, great. I hope people get a lot out of this book. I know I got a lot of it, and I'm gonna keep digging because I don't know that much about the Constitution, but I do know more than before reading the book. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. It was a delight to talk to you, and I need to learn more about the French. I learned a little about the French Constitution, but that's a whole other book.
Oh yeah, I'm there with you. I don't know that much either, I have to say, but it's a good good thing to do. All right, so thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Once again, your book is called The Year of Living Constitutionally, and it's available everywhere books are sold. People can find you online at ajjacobs.com. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This was the Blood Flow Podcast.